Good evening, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing to you Luigi's Mansion 3 for the Nintendo Switch. Some of you may be wondering why it took me so darn long to review this game, and there's a couple of reasons for it. The first is that ever since Luigi's Mansion 2 HD has been announced, I wanted to get into this entry so that I could compare and contrast how many of Luigi's Mansion 3's additions made it into the Dark Moon remake. And also just because I met Charles Martinet last year, so I can doubly appreciate his wonderful voice acting. And the final reason is that I had heard some things from people on the internet saying that this game had pacing issues and some obtuse puzzles. And while I'm not going to argue with that, that was a very small part of the experience that didn't damper my overall enthusiasm, which was for the most part overwhelmingly positive. And if I had a chance to go back in time and redo my top 10 games of 2019, this game would definitely be on it. Probably, well, that's too much to think about. Let's just focus on the review right now. I don't want to talk too much about the side modes in this game, just because a lot of them require online to properly take advantage of. You can technically play the Scare-Scraper with only one player, but it's super boring. All you do is go through a bunch of generic hotel rooms and try to hunt all the ghosts. But you do that in the main game anyway, and there are much more interesting scenarios, so I just gave up after a few minutes. There's also been some DLC since the game has come out, but all they are just new mini-games in the Scream Park and new costumes that you can only wear in the multiplayer mode. That's boring, but at least it shows that the main game was completed, and really the only major update that the team added was an in-game soundtrack player. You know how much I love those, especially since there are quite a number of songs in this game that were performed by real instruments. So you know that I'm always a sucker for genuine, authentic music. Luigi's Mansion 3, as evidenced by the number, is the third game in the Luigi's Mansion series, and as a result, it sort of is a hybrid between the first two games in terms of its structure. The first game was a lot more open, just presenting you with a large mansion, and you got to go back and forth between the rooms as you pleased once you unlocked them. But then Dark Moon ditched that in favor of having multiple mansions, and each mansion would have its own self-contained missions within. A lot of people hated that, so they decided to meld the two together in a sense, where you explore one hotel, but you're separated by various floors. And the way that the game prevents you from completely breaking it and going out of order is that the ghosts steal all of the elevator buttons. So you keep collecting the buttons from the boss ghosts, and then those allow you to proceed to higher floors of the hotel. And I find that this is a great visual indicator of how much further you have to go in the game, as you can look at how many empty slots there are for elevator buttons and say, oh, okay, I only have 4 more to go. Now that isn't necessarily a perfect indicator, as there are times when the ghosts will steal the button back from you after you've already gotten it, and then you have to backtrack to previous floors, but it wasn't nearly as bad as the internet made it out to be. The gameplay of Luigi's Mansion 3 is very similar to how it is in both the original game and Dark Moon, again providing sort of a best of both worlds. Your main ability is that Luigi has a vacuum called the Poltergust G00, or Poltergust Goo, if you get the pun, where he'll primarily vacuum pretty much everything he can. He can also blow out air. He can do a quick burst, which allows him to leap into the air and also causes everything and everyone around him to go flying away. There's the suction shot, where he shoots a plunger, and he can suck up whatever is attached to the plunger to sort of fling it around. So for example, you might see a trash can, and you can fling the trash can across the room to break it. Then there's the Dark Light device, which returns from Dark Moon, which you can use to reveal invisible objects. You can also use it to keep track of ghosts if they run into another room, which thankfully doesn't happen nearly as much as it did in the original game. There's the strobe shot, which allows you to charge up your flashlight to provide a burst of light, which is used to stun the ghosts, and then you can vacuum them up. We'll get to that in a minute. And then the final new addition to this game that I would like to mention is Gooigi. Gooigi was technically first introduced in the 3DS remake of Luigi's Mansion, but he was relegated to Player 2. He didn't have any relevance in the single-player mode. Now he's been properly integrated into the story mode. You can play this game in 2 players, but I didn't have anyone to test it with. However, it is perfectly possible to play through the entire game just switching between Luigi and Gooigi. Basically, Gooigi is just a green version of Luigi that has more slimy sounds, his voice clips are slightly higher pitched, and he can go through certain textures that Luigi can't, such as grates and drains in the floor and even pass through spikes. His only weakness is that he can't touch water. So the game has really clever ways of making sure Luigi is in one area and Gooigi is together, and it's kind of mind-blowing how many different ways the game can utilize the two of them working together. One thing that I found was a bit of a missed opportunity is that there aren't too many jokes that capitalize on the difference in personality. Gooigi is more or less an artificial intelligence, and there's one gag where the ghosts try to scare him and they're shocked because Luigi's usually kind of a scaredy cat and Gooigi just stands there with a poker face. And those jokes are few and far between, but I'm glad that at least one was given. Now, as far as how you capture the ghosts, after you've stunned a ghost with the strobe light, then you suck it up with the vacuum, and after you've pushed the control stick in the opposite direction of the ghost for long enough, then you can press the A button to literally slam the ghost into the floor and even into other objects and ghosts. This is a replacement of how in Dark Moon, after you would fill up a meter from vacuuming too much, you could press the A button to give the ghost a bit of a shock that would make the ghost's health go down faster. I must admit, this new method is significantly more satisfying, especially when the other ghosts are like terrified that you'll smack into them. So that's a nice little touch there. Next Level Games is quite amazing with providing a whole bunch of little animations, such as making Luigi be more tense and stiff when he's in a boss battle to indicate how scared he is, or how if you run long enough without any ghosts in the way, he'll gradually run faster to show that he's like, oh, this room is pretty safe, I can be confident here. Most people like to try to assign a genre to these types of games, and I would say Luigi's Mansion 3 is more of a puzzle action game. It's not really a platformer because you don't jump, but you do have to think about how to best utilize your tool set to proceed through each room. And then it's an action game in the sense that you have to know the adequate way to attack the ghosts, as they'll try to get away from your vacuum, or they might have little tricks, like they might have sunglasses to block your flashlight, so you'll have to find a more creative way to stun them. Of course, the boss ghosts return from the original Luigi's Mansion, and they each have their own unique patterns, and that's pretty cool. Generally speaking, you want to vacuum everything and anything in your path, which will give you money and sometimes hearts, and then you'll want to capture as many ghosts as possible to proceed, and eventually you'll want to get the elevator buttons back from the boss ghosts so that you can proceed to the next floor until eventually you reach the top of the hotel. I wasn't a huge fan of how gold was handled in this game. You get gold from manhandling pretty much everything in the hotel. Suck up a pillow, you get gold. Defeat a mouse with the flashlight or your vacuum, more gold. You use this to buy items from EGAD's shop, but there are a grand total of 3 things you can buy with them. A gold bone, which revives you if you run out of health, which you can stack up to 10 of them so they can be really overpowered to make it very hard to get a game over. The Boo Finder, which displays on your map where to find a boo, which are not required for story purposes, so you can just ignore those. And a Gem Finder, which shows you where to find gems on each floor, which are also not required for the story, so they are completely optional. So you see what I mean? You get so much gold that you want to spend it on something worthwhile. In Dark Moon, you would use the gold to purchase upgrades for Luigi's vacuum, but that's nowhere to be found here. And not only that, but even if you have a lot of gold, usually EGAD will only have a limited supply of the items that you want. So you'll have to come back at another time, and then you'll have way more gold than you need. Technically, the end game parameters that you had in the first Luigi's Mansion, where the more gold you had at the end, the better the ending you would get, still applies. But it's honestly not that much of a difference, and I don't think it's worth it. One thing that is really satisfying are the physics in this game. It seems like everything reacts really naturally to your vacuum's actions. Obviously, some corners were cut to make sure that it was more fun and didn't crash the game, but it is immensely satisfying to see how different objects will sway depending on whether you're sucking or exhaling, for lack of a better word, blowing out air, as well as using all of Luigi's other abilities to find creative ways to get around the environment. Some puzzles even have multiple solutions. For example, you could use the burst ability, or you could use the suction shot. Unfortunately, the game's enemies aren't quite as generous with allowing you multiple solutions to defeat them, but it is always fun to try to exploit the boss's weaknesses, especially as some of them can get quite challenging. Some people have complained that Luigi's Mansion 3 is a bit on the easy side, and I'm kinda on the fence about that. On one hand, there are some pretty challenging puzzles, and a few of them did require me to look up the solutions online. But one thing that this game does to try to offset this is that you have the EGAD helpline, where if you pause the game, which, let me remind you that the pause menu and the map are based off of the Virtual Boy, so everything is a red and black, and EGAD makes a joke about that, calling it the Virtual Boo. And he says that red and black are all the rage, and it's gonna be a massive success, so I can't believe Nintendo published a game where they can make fun of the Virtual Boy so much. Anyway, you can call him for help, but sometimes he doesn't always give you help. Sometimes he just says, you need to explore more, or he says, why are you asking me for the solution? Figure it out yourself. So it's almost like the game is mocking you for trying to use the help system. Now you can turn off automatic hints from EGAD in the options menu, as sometimes he'll just blur it in if you're stuck in a room or a boss battle for too long. Generally speaking, I found that his hints were usually really helpful, but sometimes when he didn't want to give hints, that's when I would get a little bit frustrated. Additionally, sometimes the map would have an exclamation mark saying where you needed to go, but not always. I appreciate that the game doesn't hold your hand too much, but at the same time there are times where I wish it held my hand a little bit more. Yes, it is very hard to get a game over, and most of the ghosts repeat themselves, so combat can be a bit repetitious. At the same time, it is surprisingly easy to forget how many tools you have in your arsenal. And since this game requires you to have more methodical thinking, it does feel like a bit of an escape room at times, trying to figure out the optimal way to move Luigi through the environment while remembering that he doesn't jump unless you count the burst ability, and so he doesn't have the nimbleness that Mario would typically have. Overall, I found Luigi's Mansion 3 to be a blast. The only real downsides I had were the times when the game would force you to backtrack to previous areas, especially if that kitten showed up. I genuinely hate anytime that kitten showed up. That really overstayed its welcome. But apart from that, the game throws in some wonderful animations and some amazing scenarios. Each floor is a different theme, and some of them you wonder how the heck did that work in a hotel. The voice acting by Charles Martinet is absolute peak perfection, even if I have a slight conspiracy theory that this was the game that made him consider retirement, as you can really tell that he's starting to get a bit of a rasp in his voice, and it's getting much harder for him to do the iconic voices. But hey, if this was the true final game that he worked on before retirement, besides maybe Mario Party Superstars, this was a good game to go out on, as he does a great job of capturing Luigi's timidness, while also playing Mario in this game and making him seem like the complete opposite of his brother. The music is great, the graphics and animations are some of the best I've seen on the Switch, with incredible lighting, fantastic physics, and wonderful animation. And this is absolutely one of the best games of 2019. As far as whether you should pick it up at full price, this is made with really good production values, and Next Level Games really has a commitment to making sure that they can optimize the Switch's animation to the best of their abilities. It is a pretty lengthy game, and it has quite the extensive multiplayer mode, but on the other hand, considering that it's so old, you might want to wait for it to go on sale. But if you want to support developers who seem to be very passionate about their game, and it's a very well-made and well-polished game with not really any glitches or bugs that I can think of, besides one instance where the music stopped playing randomly, that's your call. I personally think that if I were to buy this game, I would wait for it to go for $20 to $30, but since I rented it on GameFly, that wasn't really that much of a concern. I loved Luigi's Mansion 3, and I think you will as well, as long as you really like games that have more of an emphasis on puzzle solving as opposed to action. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Let me know down in the comment section what you thought of the video. Do you have any suggestions, comments, concerns, critiques, any of that stuff? Please let me know. I love reading and responding to what you guys have to say. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost, and Splatcat. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!